Disabled Americans have protested and lobbied for their rights, facing discrimination and opposition to their efforts to live independently as self-determining people. Over the course of the 20th century, those affected by mental illnesses, learning disabilities, or physical handicaps achieved progress towards these goals and emerged as a distinct social group, demonstrating that the disabled are anything but helpless. To understand the magnitude of this progress, it is important to understand the eugenics movement in the first decades of the 20th century. Eugenicists argued that the genetic features of the American population could be improved through forced sterilization and selective breeding. Their actions violated the human rights of disabled people. In 1914, Harry Laughlin proposed a model eugenical sterilization law, which advocated the sterilization of those he referred to as the, quote, socially inadequate, end quote. At the time the law was published, 12 states had already enacted similar sterilization laws, and by 1924, approximately 3,000 people had been involuntarily sterilized. Carrie Buck, a 17-year-old unwed mother, was the first person to be sentenced to involuntary sterilization by the Supreme Court. Medical officials testified that Carrie and her mother shared the hereditary traits of, quote, feeble-mindedness, end quote, and sexual promiscuity. In the court decision of Buck v. Bell, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said the following: "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The ruling of Buck v. Bell had not been overturned to this day. 33 states had laws at various times under which more than 60,000 Americans suffered involuntary sterilization procedures. A few decades after the eugenics movement, the disabled achieved some significant progress when Franklin D. Roosevelt became President of the United States in 1932. Perhaps Roosevelt's most significant contribution to the disability rights movement were the relevant parts of Roosevelt's New Deal. The Social Security Act of 1935 included federally provided health insurance and wages for disabled Americans who were unable to work, granting them a limited measure of independence from state institutions and charity organizations. In addition to Roosevelt's efforts, the disabled also advocated for themselves. The disabled people of New York City accused Roosevelt's own Works Progress Administration of discrimination. The Home Relief Bureau of New York City had been stamping the applications of the physically handicapped, allegedly to remove the applications from consideration. Physically disabled people from New York City formed the League for the Physically Handicapped in 1935 in response to this injustice. The League ended its protests when the Works Progress Administration agreed to provide more than 1,500 jobs for the disabled in New York City. In the early 1960s, Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded Camp Shriver, later renamed the Special Olympics, a summer camp for intellectually disabled children. Her goals were to explore and develop the children's athletic abilities and to empower the children by focusing on these talents instead of their disabilities. These Special Olympics continued to grow as both a sporting event and an advocacy group for the disabled, eventually showcasing the talents of more than 4.2 million athletes at 70,000 competitions worldwide. Prior to 1973, the law did very little to protect the rights of those with disabilities in the United States. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was the first significant piece of legislation to protect individuals from discrimination based on their disabilities. Targeting employers and organizations that receive any federal financial assistance, Section 504 forbade exclusion from, or denial of, an equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. This is the same protection that had been denied to disabled Americans years earlier when they were excluded from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Following 2 lower court rulings which argued that handicapped children had a right to what they called, quote, free appropriate public education, end quote, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. In 1978, the government established the National Council on Disability, or NCD, within the Department of Education. For the first time in history, those with disabilities had representatives in the national government advocating for their rights. The representatives from the NCD were instrumental in passing the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which was signed into law by George H.W. Bush. The act was one of the most significant pieces of legislation in the history of disabled Americans because it was the first official legislation to provide disabled Americans with all of the protections outlined in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Disabled people in America continue to struggle against ableism, which is discrimination against the disabled in favor of people without disabilities. Various advocacy groups have made efforts to change public opinion and promote equality. Recently, the West Virginia Disability Youth Caucus worked to ensure that younger generations know about American disabled history. Thanks to their efforts, West Virginia began requiring schools to teach about the history of disability rights during Disability Awareness History Week. There is also currently a movement known as Spread the Word to End the Word, which seeks to remove the word retard from the English language. Those who helped create the movement claimed that the word retard negatively stereotypes disabled people as a burden on society. Together with other advocacy groups, these activists spread the word that rights should not be dependent on people's status as able-bodied or disabled.